globality. So what is globality? Okay, we have this idea that the globe is out there, we can see it. We can take Stigger's definition, okay? The social condition characterized by tight economic, political, and cultural environmental interconnections and flows that make most of the currently existing borders and boundaries irrelevant. Now, so globality in a sense is partly imaginary, the idea that these borders and boundaries could be irrelevant obviously is not something that we experience every day. But at the same time, there is a way in which that social condition, such as we're living right now, the idea that everyone is interconnected, for better or for worse, is definitely something that is very real in our lives, and that thinking about looking at that globe that we've been talking about makes a visual representation of that interconnection and of our shared environment. That representation is something that's really important to us. Okay, so this global imaginary is something where we see that there's a growing awareness of this tightening of connections and intensification of interactions. Okay, so it's not only because we know that, say, an object in our home says made in somewhere else, but there's also a sense that we can go online and be in touch with, say, a cousin who lives on the other side of the world, or a friend who is perhaps across the city right now, who we can't see face to face. But there is this sense of a network that connects us. And this network is, yes, of course, we can see this in technology and computers, but it's also in all kinds of other connections. Okay, so globalization can be thought of as a set of social processes that are thought to transform our present social condition into one of globality from that of modernity. Okay, this is just one definition of globalization. Obviously, when we're talking about what globalization is, different authors, different thinkers, depending on what they are interested in, will define it slightly differently. But there is a sense in which there is an increased intensification, a drawing together, and a speeding up of processes, both social, political, also intellectual and cultural. And that this is somehow different than what took place in modernity. And we'll go back to questions of modernity in a moment. So that's what we think of as globalization, this set of conditions of things that are happening in the world. Globality, on the other hand, would be a condition of global economic, political, cultural, and environmental interconnections and flows that make many of the currently existing borders and boundaries porous. Okay, so globalization can actually be focused on aspects of, for instance, ideology of the nation state becoming increasingly prevalent. Okay, so that has to do with setting up borders. But globality is recognizing that these that there are flows that are going across existing borders, whether they be of language, of physical space, of nation, or others. Okay, so globalization has four main characteristics. Okay, so we want to think about, what are some of the characteristics of globalization? Again, certain authors may emphasize certain characteristics, depending on what you're trying to understand. Some of these may be more relevant than others. So one of the things about globalization is that it will create new networks, and it will multiply existing social networks. So in the past, when we had, you look at something like the old Silk Road, as we did in the readings last week, we look at the social, development of these networks intensifying existing networks, but also the creation of new networks. So more and more kinds of social networks, um, and the expansion and stretching of social relations and interdependencies to more and more areas of the world. So with globalization, increasingly these networks are broader. They encompass areas that perhaps 100 years ago they might not have. And the world is increasingly um, within the same web of connection and exchange. So it's about social relationships, it's about economic relationships, and these are not only more interdependent, there's an intensification and acceleration of these social exchanges and activities. Okay, so even today, as we are, at home, in spite of all that, there are certain kinds of intensifications that are taking place online, and even in trying to get particular kinds of, say, medical supplies or food to places that need them. So there is still this intensification and acceleration behind this. And of course, these acceleration and intensification of exchanges have something to do with things like the propagation of a virus or any other kind of contagion across borders. Consciousness of the creation, expansion, and intensification of social interconnections is also important in globalization. In other words, these things are all happening. It's not like they're just happening without people being aware of them. People are attuned to the fact that, for instance, they are participating in these. And of course, today, when we're not allowed to, for instance, travel, even across our own cities, let alone across national borders, we're ever more aware of how generally we take for granted this globalization. Whereas, say, even when I was a child, taking an airplane was something that was quite unusual. It was very expensive. There weren't that many networks. There weren't that many flights. Today, it still remains expensive to go to certain places, but certainly, generally before our big crisis, people were traveling much, much more readily and easily. So how can we define globalization? Let's just take the working definition that Stiger offers. Refers to a multidimensional set of social processes that create, multiply, stretch, and intensify worldwide social interdependencies and exchanges, while at the same time fostering in people a growing awareness of deepening connections between the local and the distant. Okay, I'm just going to leave this on the screen for a moment so you can read it again yourself. It brings together those different aspects that I've just described. So it is multidimensional. Okay, it's multidimensional. It intensifies, it stretches, it brings more people in, and it also means that we are aware of those connections between where we are now and the distant. Okay, and of course, today we may be especially aware of that, but even in, even say 3 months ago, before all of the current situation came into play, we would still be very aware that what something is happening here in my home has something to do with distant places. Perhaps because I know many more people in distant places than I would have I lived 100 years ago. Perhaps simply because the objects in my home come from all over the world. Perhaps because I'm just aware of what's happening because of the news and because I'm on internet. Okay, now are there challenges to globalism? Of course, there's economic challenges, to globalism. We can try and stop networks and make them more local. So there can be a particular this protectionism where we say, no, we want to do everything locally. For instance, my country would only like to trade if absolutely necessary, or we think that, it's better to do local. Now, whether it's good or bad might depend on your position on a single question. Let's say, for instance, particularist protectionism that might be ecologically based might propose that local products would be more ecologically, sound, rather than importing things that might be out of season where we live, and that are going to use up a lot of greenhouse gases, etc. Okay. Universalist protectionism. In this case, we're going to want to think about the world as a whole, but yet protecting from certain kinds of globalizing trends. We can think of, for instance, anti-WTO protests, and the idea that people are, quote, against globalization, or at least against the kind of globalization that they see as taking place, perhaps too quickly, perhaps with the wrong motives, perhaps not favoring an equal distribution of the benefits of globalization, etc. Or, of course, then there's populist and nationalist reactions to globalism, with the idea that, no, we really don't want to have the world intrude on our way of life. We want to stick with the people who are like ourselves. We want to maintain a certain idea of our world that we belong to, that may be more local, that may be confined to people from a particular culture, or who speak a particular language. And so these are challenges to the idea of some sort of universal globalism, and to some degree to the development of globalization. Is globalization good or bad? Well, a lot of people will have different ideas about this. Clearly, some people are worried that globalization isn't, good for everyone. Some people are worried that certain localities may be benefiting more than others. Many people, like myself, probably think it's a mixture of positive and negative results. A lot of the times people criticize it for being neoliberal, and one can wonder, does it have to be? Is it necessarily? As a scholar, when we're thinking about globalization, we don't start out and say, well, oh, this is really bad, I want to study it, or this is really good, let's promote it. We think of globalization as something that we study and that helps to illuminate what's possible. And once we have this kind of knowledge about these processes of increased networks, of intensification, of speeding up, of connections, then we can decide, well, how can this be done in one way or another? Okay, so usually this is a question students always ask, is globalization good or bad? It probably means not so much the processes, but how it's distributed, where it happens, and the different results, whether it's on the ecosystem, whether it's on issues of inequality, etc. Okay, so how and why do researchers study globalization, and what are some of its aspects? These are some of the questions that we might ask ourselves. How do you do when you have all these different networks? How do you actually study a network? Okay, what aspects? So, of course, no one can know everything. Some researchers will look at processes of globalization and look at the economy, for instance. Obviously, economists, but people, economists, anthropologists, sociologists. There are different ways of looking at the processes of globalization and economic, whether it's impact, whether it has to do with poverty, whether it has to do with businesses, trade. These are all aspects of what people studying globalization are interested in. So how does globalization affect the economy? It's clear that it does, but how? Obviously, political processes of globalization. What happens when we have something like the EU? What does Brexit have to do with it? How does, will Turkey join the EU? These kinds of questions that have to do with, sort of standard political science questions, but also, how are processes of globalization and ideas of globality altering our political imaginary? So that's something that, say, people studying literature, people studying art, anthropologists, humanists will be interested. How does this process of globalization change how we think about human history? Clearly, technology is very important in processes of globalization. Um, this is something that we all experience in our everyday lives more and more intensely. Um, we can imagine that, online studying, online exchanges, the development of studies of big data, all kinds of new ways of studying globalization are actually facilitated by technology, but we also study, what is this impact of globalization? If I'm more connected to my family in some other country or my friends around the world than I am to my neighbor, what does that mean about the society I'm living in? The environment is obviously global. It does not respect boundaries. So people studying the environment need to know about global processes. A scientist who's studying forest fires or pollution or how to desalinate water so people have water around the world. All of these people will want to know something about the social and cultural aspects of globalization because they play a big role in the reasons that we do things like consume fossil fuels, for instance. If we suddenly stop driving, as we are now, we see that the air is a lot cleaner all of a sudden. The greenhouse gases are not being emitted. But of course, this is due to an enormous change and not a very welcome one, of course, in the way that we're living every day. Finally, there are cultural processes of globalization. The McDonaldization of culture. Why does everybody eat a Big Mac around the world? Why do those Big Macs not, why are they made differently around the world? All of this has to do with globalization as well. These are things that we'll cover in particular detail in this class because it is focused on issues of culture to a great degree. And when we say culture, we don't just mean, the movies or culture in the high culture sense of going to the symphony or even an art gallery, but we're thinking about everyday culture, like what people eat, what they watch on television, what kind of music they like, and what are the processes, how has globalization changed culture? This is something that I've been particularly fascinated on during my research. So this is definitely something that we're going to be pursuing more in further courses. Okay, so where did globalization start? It could be, we can go back to ancient roads, whether it's the Silk Road, there were places all over the ancient world that were trading. If you want to know more about that, take the Global Cities course because we talk a lot about those early cities and connections between them. But really what we'll be looking at in this class is from the early modern period on, once we have the beginning of these globalizing processes in a very intense way, and that relate to certain technical changes. So they go along with modernity and the idea of the Enlightenment, certain ideologies of universalism. Okay, so the idea, maybe not the practice, certainly not the practice, but the idea that say all people are created equal, that there should be some, oftentimes related to movements for republican and democratic forms of polities, the invention of the printing press that gives more and more people access to knowledge, windmills, things like making the wind work for us to produce our food, the postal system that its development during this period between 1500 and 1750 allowed people to exchange things long before we had internet, very important. The development of maritime technology and navigation, okay, obviously related to the possibility to, for the Europeans to launch the voyages of discovery, but also for scientists like Darwin to travel the world and develop new theories. And of course, then for the relationship between what I've mentioned before, this development of a certain hegemony of the European states throughout the world. We will get back to that as well. And then, of course, the idea of the Reformation in Europe, which led to, going back to the Enlightenment, the idea of liberal political ideas, the Reformation being the reformation of the European Christian church, and the way that that movement fed into the idea of the Enlightenment and liberal political ideas. This is related to the mercantile era with cities, merchant classes, individualism, material accumulation, the rise of these big companies, which, yes, British or Dutch East India companies, they were in effect multinationals, and all of this involved, overseas trade. So we see this, political changes, religious changes, mercantile changes, again, related to this European dominance, the discovery of the Americas, the forced labor in the Americas, and of course the Atlantic slave trade. All of this bound what were for Europeans the new continents. They've profoundly transformed the Americas and created increased intensity, kind of the basis of globalization and of the current situation. Okay, so is globalization different from modernization? Remember, we talked about the modern period when we have the Westphalia system of state and national government, the idea that the nation state controls the territory, population, and culture. Okay, so there's this shared language, history, those colors on the map when we can say this is who belongs here. And of course, this was related to sort of ideas of enlightenment, reason, science, new disciplines and knowledge, and vast changes in technology, things like the creation of, the invention of the train, of the automobile. There's no strict way of defining this period, but we could say it's between 1750 and 1970, just as a ballpark figure to begin with. Okay, so the modern period is generally this period of, yes, nascent globalization, but when we're talking about globalization today, there is something that happens around 1970 to some people. Some people say it's even 1989. By that time, colonialism had been done away with in general, broadly. So, the formal colonies had nationalized. You had the remnants of this colonialism. So you still had some settlers, settler colonialism, such as in the United States or Australia or South Africa, where there were a lot of settlers who came and displaced other populations. You had colonial administrators, missionaries, the solidification of things like the caste system, notions of progress, but that were led by a certain country. All of these were part of this kind of modern configuration. Yes, there's a post-colonialism that persists, but nonetheless, we're sort of beyond that in the sense that there are now independent states in those places. Technology, again, some people say it was more 1970, others say it's 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall that changes from modernity with its industrialization to our sort of post-modernity and post-Fordist information technology focused worlds. Whether it's 1970, 1989, 2001, there are different opinions about this. Some people would say we have to go way back, even further in history. But overall, you know, the processes are what's important. It's not that we have to pin a certain date on it. If we're studying, the fall of the Soviet Union, obviously 1989 is a big date. If we're really interested in the rise of the personal computer, well, the date is probably a bit earlier when, say, the Apple, home computer was invented. So a lot of the perspective you'll take about which moment of globalization is important in your study would be based on what you're interested in. Nonetheless, a lot of the processes will be very similar. Okay, so some of the things that are very important for the basis of economic globalization were the Bretton Woods Agreement at the end of World War II, with the setting of gold standard, the creation of the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and GATT, which is now the WTO, the World Trade Organization. The economic globalization is going to be somewhat secondary in this course, but it's worth mentioning that a lot of the current basis for the economy, a lot of the things that we'll talk about less directly through cultural and social issues got started in the post-World War II setting, which is substantially different than what we know now. Okay, as we saw, some people would say that was all about modernity. What about today? What about globalization? What about post-modernity? People will say, well, that's the new neoliberal economic order. It's more internationalized. We see a liberalization of financial transactions. It becomes easier to trade. We can just go online and send money around the world. There are very powerful transnational corporations. And we see an enhanced role of the international economic institutions that were set up at the end of World War II. So these are some of the characteristics of the neoliberal economic order that would differentiate today's economics from the earlier period after World War II. Okay, so when we talk about neoliberalism, this we'll hear a lot and we'll read a lot about it. It comes up all of the time in political discourse. This is what people are talking about. Okay, so liberalism was sort of the 19th century or 20th century movement. Neoliberalism is, those who would say there is a neoliberalism are suggesting that something else is happening. A little bit like globalization, there's a change in scale that's taking place. Okay, some of the political dimensions. Again, globalization changes that Westphalian idea of sovereignty. Okay, each country for itself. It pushes global networks. It encourages regional organizations to form, whether for trade or in a more cohesive political way with, say, the European experiment. It places global organizations in a more prominent, if not a more powerful role. And when we start thinking about the political dimensions, we can imagine globalism either coming from above, say from these organizations or from the state, or from below. Okay, so there's a political element of people themselves being more and more interconnected and having a certain idea of how they fit into conversations that are going around the world. We see how discourses about politics travel much more easily than they did in the days when, say, 100 years ago, many few people were literate, many fewer people had access to news, and now today we can go online and get this with all the advantages that that gives us, but also some of the disadvantages, given things like where the information is coming from, etc. There are cultural dimensions of globalization. Of course, this has to do with meaning making. It has to do with how we interact socially. Increasingly, people can feel at ease in different places because social practices, perhaps are more similar than they were in the past. Of course, thinking about the environment, about cultural imperialism, about homogeneity. You know, are we all becoming more the same? Um, what does it mean if we have